This generally ends up being what people consider like one of the best artworks they have made so far. I get a lot of feedback on this one in the class survey at the end of the semester. So keep that in mind as we navigate through this. So this is our grid enlargement project. You may have seen in the past students creating like large portraits of people using pencil and pencil shading. So this will review a lot of the shading techniques and that foundation that we laid in Art 1. But we're going to apply it on a much different scale. And this is one of those projects where it seems kind of large and maybe overwhelming at first, but the technique we're going to show you breaks it down to very, very manageable kind of little bite-sized pieces. And that's why people feel such growth with this project, because it does seem kind of large and impressive and maybe overwhelming at first, but then by the time you navigate through it and work through that, you end up seeing what you are capable of, and it's a good thing. So, why do we do this technique? It has literally been used by artists for centuries. This is part of our skills that work with observational and visual proportions. So we're going to work with using language like that is half as big as the other thing, or that is twice as big as the other thing, or that part goes a third of the way. Those kind of fractional observations where we're not measuring and saying this is a quarter of an inch, but we're saying this goes halfway between point A and point B. So working with those visual skills is something that is important to develop as an artist, regardless of what type of visual design you might use in the future. It scales well, so we can use this technique to make things bigger. Theater, like scenic painters, use this all the time because they might be painting a wall that is 20 feet high and 40 feet across, right? I have done that numerous years out in Seymour, where they literally have a wall that is that big. At the same time, it goes the other direction too. So if you ever need to make something proportionally smaller, you can use the exact same technique and it scales to any size that you might need. The other thing, like I talked about, is this is really good for breaking what seems like a really big problem down into much more manageable pieces. And by only focusing on that small piece at a time, you might be kind of surprised at what you are capable of that might seem like more challenging than it really is. Okay? We talked about developing that ability to see visual proportions. That's a really important visual skill to have, not just for creating art, but then also for evaluating visual images in any sort of future endeavor that you might be working on. And this is going to sound really weird, but we're going to practice thinking with our eyes instead of thinking with our brain. And I know that you don't really actually think with your eyes, like I know that, right? But the reason I say that and the technique that we're going to use and just be mindful of is when we see things, our brain makes certain assumptions about what we see. And that is like a very human, almost like a survival type thing, right? When you don't need to like focus with so much detail on something because it's something that you see all the time. Like, for example, we all know what a face looks like. We see them all the time, right? But if I asked you to draw a face, you would realize that we don't actually look with enough detail and with enough focus and intention to really know what the length of a nose is, what are the proportions of the nose to the eyes, right? And so we're going to start to look at that stuff in much greater detail with much greater intent. And that can be a challenge because your brain is going to want to just be like, oh, I know what a face looks like. Like, I don't have to look at that anymore. But you really do, because that doesn't always line up with what reality is. And sometimes our brain makes assumptions that are not accurate. And that's why if you ever have tried to draw something and you ended up looking at it and saying, well, that doesn't look right at all, that's because your brain is just like filling in the gaps and it's making these assumptions that is happening very subconsciously. And so now we're going to practice being more conscious of that and more aware of that. And then kind of metaphorically saying like, no brain, we're gonna focus on what we actually see, not what we think we know, okay? And that can be kind of challenging and kind of weird feeling. You're literally using your brain in different ways than you are used to. So it might feel a little different at first. That's okay, okay? We also are going to personalize something that we are interested in. So when we talked about yesterday finding a photo that either you took or that someone else took, being able to use that in a different way is a really good way to work with developing ideas in art and in visual design. So, you are not going to work with a cartoon, you are also not going to work with copyrighted characters, but for the sake of the demonstration right now, and so that it goes faster, I'm going to give you a really brief overview of the method that we're going to use, okay? So let's say, hypothetically, I told you to draw this picture as accurately and as exactly as possible. Some of you could probably do that pretty well, but if you actually took a ruler to the final version, you might find some discrepancies, okay? And that's where that eye versus brain thing kind of kicks in. So the technique that we're going to use in order to ensure accuracy and to scale from a small photo to something that is larger in the drawing but still accurately sized is this grid method. So whatever photo you find and end up choosing from your phone or from wherever you're going to find it, we're going to print it on a piece of paper in black and white, okay? So it does not have to be a color photo. And then once we print that photo, I'm going to show you how to put a grid on it. And the reason we're going to do that is now instead of thinking about the whole photo as one big thing, we're going to focus on each little section. And if I only showed you one little box of this, and I asked you to draw that one little box, do you think that would be like way easier to do an accurate job? Yes, absolutely. So here is how the technique works if you are not already familiar with it, and my board looks like total crap right now. Okay, so I'm gonna look at just this one box for right now. And we're not going to focus on any other boxes. And if you are somebody that gets kind of visually overwhelmed or visually distracted, you might even want to like put some other pieces of paper over the other parts. So it's like a surgeon, like you hone in on only that one part that you're looking at, okay? And then I'm going to draw that in this box, which is obviously bigger than what this box is. Now, how much bigger? Is it twice as big? Is it 3 times as big? I don't know, it doesn't matter, because we're not going to actually measure in inches or in centimeters or in a measurable unit, but we're going to look at proportions instead. So I'm going to look at this curve of the eye first, okay? And if you were doing this on your photo, you would be kind of breaking down the different facial features into lines and shapes and areas. So instead of thinking of something as an eye, you might think of it as a series of curves, or as a series of lines, or as some shapes, right? And even just that language change in your brain forces you to look at it differently than if you say, oh, it's an eye, and your brain goes, oh, I know what an eye looks like, and then you don't look as closely, right? So I'm going to look at where this curve of that shape crosses this grid line, which is right there, okay? And that is almost halfway between these two grid lines. It's slightly to the right of where exactly halfway would be. Does that make sense? Okay, I didn't use a ruler to figure that out. I just looked at visually where is halfway, and then I compared, okay? You might also look at, is it a third of the way? Is it a quarter of the way, right? So here is, we'll do it in this box so it's higher and you can see it. Here's where halfway would be between here and here, and I said that one is just slightly to the right, so I'm going to go slightly to the right. So that's where that eye, that curve is going to fall. Now I'm going to look at the other side. Where does this now fall on the other grid line? Here is where halfway would be, so this is slightly below halfway. It's not all the way, like if I divided halfway to here and I did a quarter of the way. It's not all the way there, right? So it's just slightly below. So here is where halfway would be, and then here's where a quarter would be. It's about a third of the way between there and there, so it would be about there. Does that make sense how I arrived at the placement of that one little visual mark? Okay, it's a lot of thought to put into one little mark, but when you do that, you give yourself this really accurate framework, and then you just have to kind of connect the dots. So, does it make a straight line between here and there? No, it makes a little bit of a curve, but if I was to make a straight line up and across, that curve diverts out from it. It never stays parallel with that line, so this is going to curve out from here, and then the same thing happens from here. It goes kind of horizontal, but then it comes down right away. So I'm going to go from here, down right away, okay? And this is the kind of thing where you are not going to just go like this and hope that you hit it right on the first try, because your chances of hitting it right on the first try are not good enough that it's worthwhile, right? But you're going to put in some guide marks, you're going to make some adjustments, and then you're going to evaluate. Does that look accurate? What adjustments do I need to make so that it is accurate? Does that make sense? So it's kind of like when you draw a circle, it's like never quite right away. You just make adjustments, okay? So you would do that, and then you would go on to the next, whatever features are in that box. Does that technique make sense? Because that is really the heart of it. You're doing that, but a lot of times in all of the boxes, okay? If something about this is confusing for you, I'm happy to help you to get this, because you need to understand this really, really thoroughly in order to go on with the project. So this, like I said, it's a method that it can be applied in a whole bunch of ways. Pixel art has been created that way. These happen to be Post-it notes, and if you look at some of these frames, you can see their source photo and how they gridded it, and then they basically just counted out how many squares of each color. So this one isn't going by the lines and the shapes, but of kind of reproducing the colors, but it's the same method, right? You're taking a small thing and you're proportionally enlarging it to a larger size. And the artist that we're looking at who kind of made a lot of money and got a lot of fame off of using this method is Chuck Close, okay? So Chuck Close, in his early life, he was not necessarily somebody who people thought was like destined to be a famous artist, right? He had a pretty rough childhood growing up. He was dyslexic. He had a lot of difficulties with learning and difficulties with school. And people, some of his teachers even thought he was just dumb and thought he was lazy because he wasn't making progress academically, and he was really struggling with that. And his family was not well off. They did not have good health insurance. He had some physical challenges, disabilities as a child, and so he had all of these things kind of stacked against him. He didn't, people didn't think very highly of him in his early life, but he did like to draw. And if you watch some of his interviews, he talks about how when he would study for tests, reading things wasn't working well for him, so he would draw things, and then he could remember that more easily because he was a more visual thinker. Some of you might relate, right? And so eventually, once he was able to kind of harness that visual ability and translate it to ways that worked for him, he was able to graduate from the University of Washington and from Yale, which is a pretty big deal, right? Even people who do not have learning disabilities sometimes might not be able to achieve that. He did establish a successful career as a photorealist portrait artist, meaning that he was working from photos, and his intent as an artist was making these portraits look like photos even though they were drawings or paintings, okay? Now, we're not expecting that at a high school level, but the method works to be able to do that, okay? And that was during the 1970s. That was about the height of when he started to become more well-known, more famous. And right at the height of his career, he had a spinal blood clot. and it disabled him. It totally changed the way he moved, the way he was able to interact with the world, and so he had to adjust how he was making his art and the way his art was appearing, that kind of visual style, to accommodate that disability and his physical limitations. Okay, so this is a quote, I'll share this with you. He's basically looking at the idea that areas of the face or things that we see that we typically think are not as important, he wanted to draw attention to. So things like skin texture, things like, you know, the space between your eyebrows, that is not like one of the main features of the face. And he's giving visual importance to all of those different features. So this is him before his disability took place. So this is him, looks very 70s, right? And these are his artworks in his studio. So these are not small little, like, throw it in the back of your car kind of artworks. These are really, really large. And in one of the interviews, he talks about, like, he was asked, like, well, why do you make things so big? And he said, because it takes you longer to walk by. So he was making big things because he wanted people to see them. He wanted more visual attention. He wanted to make more of a statement, to have more of a presence with his artwork, because that was how you got attention, right? There was no social media back then. And so this is like the scale of, in a gallery, right, how big something would be compared to the average human that's looking at it, right? And so the fact that eye level is just about eye level with the subject is not an accident. But this is a drawing. It was created with pencil, with charcoal, with art materials. That's not just a large print of a photo. But using the technique that we just described, he was able to do this with such great accuracy. Some people describe him as a hyper-realist artist because of the level of accuracy that he gets down to with the teeny tiniest of details. Okay, we're talking like individual facial hairs, right? Individual pores on the skin. You will not have to do individual facial hairs and individual pores to the level that he did. But the method still works, right? So this is this art piece, okay? That's how big it is, floor to ceiling, right? And then when you look at it, now the size that you're seeing it on the screen isn't even as big as it would be in real life, but are you seeing like the level of detail, the individual little hairs, the pores, the wrinkles, the direction of the way the hairs go, the little, what do you call this, the reflection, right, in the lenses of his glasses, the hardware, like every little thing that he was able to capture in a photograph, then he was magnifying and bringing attention to in his artwork. And that was part of his goal as an artist, was to bring attention to all these details that normally people don't pay attention to. Your brain kind of sees them as mundane and unimportant, and it makes assumptions and it kind of goes past them, right? Once his disability had an effect on him, he was not able to have the fine motor control to be able to paint or draw with such dexterity, so he totally changed his method. He's still using the grid method, but now he uses each little grid square as kind of its own little abstract painting. And so he's still creating these grid portraits, but the method is a little bit altered so that he was able to do it with less motor control. And this kind of shows the process. So he would go through in one pass and just kind of put in a base color, put in maybe an abstract shape. And then in the second pass, he would start to layer shapes on top so that over the course of all that layering from a distance, right, it starts to almost assemble the pixels and put those colors together. That's called optical mixing, when your eye kind of blends it together from a distance, and you can still see the image. This is a self-portrait of him, by the way. Okay, so this is him working in his studio. This is the photo that he took. So he intentionally took and lit these photos in a very specific way, and then he would go row by row and then add all of the layers. And then you can see they accommodated his studio. So this is like a slot in the floor, and these giant paintings would ride on these tracks, and they would go up and down so that he could sit in his wheelchair and still access all of the surfaces of the painting. Okay, so here's his grid. right? There's the method. Some of his grids were diagonal, some were straight up and down. You saw the circular example. He worked with people of different skin tones and using these different kind of base colors to do the optical mixing. You guys will not have to worry about color. We're going to do yours in black and white. These are also colors, right? If you look up close, there's tones to this, but it comes across as black and white. So these are what yours are going to look like. They're going to be pencil drawings, full range of values, so light lights to dark darks, all of the middle grays in between, and we're going to use accuracy as much as possible to recreate those values using, like I said, the foundation of shading techniques that you guys learned in Art 1. But our goal is to recreate like a headshot, accurate facial features, accurate values, accurate dimensionality, so that you get a really nice portrait of everything. Does that make sense? Okay, so by tomorrow, you need to have at least one, ideally 2 or 3 if you want like some backup options, photos, high resolution photos of portraits that you are going to want to draw. Does that make sense? Questions? You don't know what you're looking for?